We are about to begin our final panel, and there were a couple of things I needed to say that I didn't say in the beginning, so I'll go ahead and thank Penn Museum for having us here. I'd like to thank the Historic Preservation Department of the Weitzman School of Design for their support of this event. Also like to thank Africana Studies Department for their support of this event. I would like to thank the Penn Museum Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Initiative for supplying our panelists and moderators with their lunch, as well as providing our tour guides. We're not going on like actual physical tours through the Africa galleries, but we will have folks stationed in the Africa galleries, at least 4 folks from the Community Engagement and Learning program or department, I should say, at Penn Museum. So I'm happy that they'll be there to talk to us about the holdings in the Africa galleries. And I'd like to thank my tech team because they're awesome. They like literally feel like a team. Woo! Like, yeah, I'm like, they got my team. And our caterers as well. I think I've hit just about all the folks I'm supposed to thank. I'd like to thank you for being here. Okay. Yes, yes, yes. We've been sharing so many really important stories. There are descendants in the room, and I thought about when we started of having us do like an exercise of everyone who has had a descendant or an ancestor who was on the Clotilda to please stand up. And I think I'm gonna do that now. If you know that you had an ancestor who was on the Clotilda, could you please stand up? Could you please? You're like, we were just standing up and you told us to sit down. Don't be shy. All right, we've got a few more. I know they're in Vita. If you have an ancestor, keep standing, that you know went through the Middle Passage, could you please stand up? If you can stand, this is obviously. We are what remains. We are what remains. We are the evidence that we need. Okay? We're here. And that's important. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, well, our moderator for this final panel. And that's Dr. Kwesi Daniels. Dr. Kwesi Daniels is the head of the architecture department at Tuskegee University, at the Tuskegee University. His professional experiences range across a variety of disciplines, including historic preservation, architecture, sustainability management, and urban geography. Over his 20-year career, he has worked for architecture firms and government agencies on public and private sector building projects across the country. He has played an active role in NOMA, the National Organization of Minority Architects, the Alabama Black Heritage Council, and Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. His greatest honor has been teaching at Tuskegee, at Temple at NYU, Columbia, and Penn. That wasn't in his bio. Okay. In 2018, he began developing a historic preservation program at Tuskegee, which has resulted in the documentation of civil rights sites in Selma, Montgomery, and Tuskegee, Alabama. I hope that will, I'm assuming, hoping, planning for that to include Africatown. Professor Daniels earned his B.Arch and M.Arch in architecture from Tuskegee in the University of Illinois at Chicago, and a master's in sustainability management from Columbia. In 2020, quite a fateful year, he earned his PhD in urban geography from Temple right here in Philadelphia. And I'm going to pause there and let him come to the stage, and so he can introduce our next panelist. Thank you, Dr. Daniels.
Good afternoon. Mics are always a thing, you better fix it before you get it right. All right, brother. It's great to be back in Philly. While it's not home, it is home. I grew up in New Jersey. So as I told somebody, and you're from New Jersey, everything south of Jersey is considered south. So the person who we'll be inviting up first will be Miss Renee Kemp-Rotan. And I would go ahead and read the bio and all of that, but I've known this wonderful lady for a very long time. She's one of my mentors. And one of the things that was most remarkable about the work that she was doing with Africatown and the ideas competition, which we'll all see and hear from her in a second, is that every time I saw her present, it was as if she gave a brand new presentation every time, and each one was more magnificent than the last. The level of dedication, the level of time and energy and effort that she poured into the project was truly amazing, and that alone is something that we should all really marvel at and study when it comes to our spaces. She didn't take it lightly. She didn't take it as somebody who's been in the space and I know what to do. She took it as a very serious engagement and gave it the honor that the panelists that were up here before that it deserved. And when she invited me down to give a talk about the work we were doing in historic preservation, that was when I got a chance to meet the folks that were doing the work. Mr. Womack, I had been on some of the emails you had sent around prior to that. But what it said to me is that she had the buy-in of the community. She wasn't a hovering person flying in to make some decisions. She was really focused on the guidance that the community could give her, and was honoring that. And so without further ado, I'm going to have Ms. Renee Kemp-Rotan come on up.
Wow. I always am suffering from great anticipation when it's time to present yet another version of this competition that I've been obsessed with now for 5 years. But, first I want to give a shout out to the Africatowners. Jocelyn, I just want you to stand. Joe, I just want you to stand. Gary Lumbers, please stand. I want to tell you, Vita, please stand. Without these folks, there would really be no carrying and continuation of the story. We're here because you guys have held up this bloodstained banner forever, and we so salute you and the continuing work that you are doing to save the community. Truly, we are honored to be here. I'm Renee Kemp-Rotan. I start every presentation this way. I'm the first Black woman to finish Syracuse University in architecture, and that was 1975. You have to carry the one, okay? So part of that training, 5 years at Syracuse, 2 of which were at the Architectural Association in London, studying under Archigram, and also Paul Oliver, the great cultural geographer. That's important as to how I got involved in the depth of the story. Then went to Columbia, finished Columbia Regional Urban Planning, served at the National Endowment for the Arts as head of national design competitions. So this is a genre, the competition, as a tool that I know fairly well. I'm from DC originally, moved down south in 1995 to serve as a senior master planner for the Olympics in Atlanta. Stayed in Atlanta as head of economic development for the city of Atlanta, then became chief of urban design and urban development for the city, then moved over to Birmingham to run a $200 million capital bond program. So I understand infrastructure and how to move money around to get stuff done. But in 2018, I was invited to Africatown by a friend of mine, Vicki Howell, who said, you've got to come down here and do something. We have organizations and everybody has a project, but none of the projects are co-joined. And to make a long story short, I reached into my bag of tricks and I said, well, what we need is a design competition, because a design competition provides a method whereby which you have to get information from the community in order to program the design challenge, okay? That means you've got to talk to everyone to find out what the community wants. And because you want to see the community get back something that they need and admire, you have to be a really, really good listener. So there were a number of civic engagement events. Being an outsider, you also have to submit to, let's just say, African protocol. You don't come into the village and start moving stuff around without first asking permission. And so my very good friend Joe Womack and also Anderson Flynn said, excuse me, before you talk about doing anything here, we're going to call a community-wide meeting. And you're going to introduce the idea, and then we're going to take a vote to see what the community will have you do or not do. Now, when you go down south unintroduced, you know, folks can be real friendly, but they'll put you on the next train, you know, with a cardboard box of fried chicken and an apple, say, see you later. So my first introduction to Africatown was really through the work of Joe and Anderson Flynn, who are the co-founders of the Africatown Heritage Preservation Foundation. I can name every organization in Africatown because of that introduction, and that's how we ended up collecting information. But to make a long story short, originally when I came with the idea that the competition was a tool, I was thinking that, yeah, we'll do a competition and we'll have people from around the world help us figure out what an imaginary Africatown museum will look like. Great idea. I went back to the community said, we need more than that. I said, well, what else do you need? We need housing. Someone needs to look at the school, the cemetery. I mean, by the time they finished, I had a list of 16 things that the community needed to have designed. So like a totally crazy person, I took on the challenge and figured out how to organize all of those wishes into really one of the largest multi-site Afrocentric competitions that the world has ever seen. The amount of research that I had to go through in order to honor the history, I read the book that was edited by Deb Plant-Barracoon, cover to cover, the Sylvia Diop book. I read everything I could. Dark Space was just coming out, written by Mario Gooden, sitting right there in the chair. There was a lot of information that was being put forth by the Black architectural community as well. While all this was going on, competition was just getting started, the Smithsonian's National Museum of History and Culture was also having a 3-day symposium on the history of Black activism in Black architecture. So it was a convening of a whole bunch of energy and a whole bunch of minds that fed what we've tried to do here. We also were very clear that almost all of the history and news that we were getting about Africatown was dealing with the history of Africatown and the present day challenges in Africatown. But architecturally, I was asking, well, what would the future of Africatown look like? And what role can Black architects play in what the future of that architecture might look like? So, moving forward, COVID got in the way, we had to switch things around. But at the end of the day, I ended up writing 160 pages of design program. And even when that went out around the world in order to solicit submissions, I was very confused as to whether anyone would understand what we were asking. 40 pages is a lot of script to read before you get to put a pencil down. So I get choked up about it because in February of this year, all of the submissions came back and we were absolutely stunned. Folks read the program. Folks dug into the history of the place, and the spiritual responses that we got back architecturally are astounding. We are going to share quite a bit of information with you, because I know I only have 15 minutes, But never mind you that. We've got a couple of winners here that we're going to introduce you to. We're going to introduce you to Jerome Haferd. We're going to introduce you to a couple of members of the profound jury that we put together. Mario Gooden was one of our design commandos. And then we're going to also, you got to stand up. This is Kamau Kambui. He was on Team Jamaica that won third place in the competition for Site 1, and he always shows up. Wherever I do a presentation, he's sitting in the back. So I always have to recognize. It's a big deal. Two other things I'm going to say, and then I have an 11-minute slideshow, so I'm pretty safe, and it's timed, right? So Vicki Howell, who was a good friend of mine, who lived in Mobile. When I first moved to Birmingham, one of the things I put together was the Birmingham Civil Rights Heritage Trail. And Google it, because what I did was to take photographs of the Birmingham movement, blow it up life-size, and reinsert them in the places where those things actually happened in Birmingham. She wrote the script. So when I came to Africatown, she said, do something, and we had already worked together. So we put together this website. The website got 20,000 hits worldwide. We got 118 teams internationally to come after the money, because we actually raised $100,000 in cash prize money. That was no easy feat. And at the end of the day, we had 23 teams that actually submitted. Some of the teams had up to 4 people. They submitted at the end 169 boards of ideas and 150 pages of design essays. And we're still trying to take it all in. So with no further ado, I think, is this electric? Let's hit the next button and see what happens. Okay, so here are the major things that happened. The Clotilda landed in the Gulf, there's Cudjoe, there's the book. That's what the land looked like. That went really fast. And here's a video that I put together, animation, so you will understand why we did the competition. Is there sound? Turn the sound up just a bit. Just watch this. So I did 9 of these animations that went around the world to re-explain what the intent was. Then I also included this on the website, because the Clotilda didn't happen in a vacuum. These little black dots that are moving across the Atlantic Ocean are an animation of the actual slave ships that carried our people from Africa to, quote unquote, the New World, and those are the years. So the transport of Africans out of Africa is kidnapped human cargo. This wasn't about 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Over 400 years, it took 50,000 ships to transport 12 million people. What a story. In 1808, you'll watch the traffic change because the international slave trade and its cargo transport to the United States was ended. And I want you to see what happens in 1860, when the Clotilda, in fact, made its voyage. This is how we got over here. This is how it was done. Not accidental. This was a business. And those are all of our people on those boats. These are the stories we have never been told. So when people say, why don't you get over it? That's the depth of our blood memory of what occurred. And we see 75% is going to Brazil, the Caribbean, et cetera, et cetera. So by the time you get to 1860, very few ships are coming to the United States because they have been outlawed. So 1860, the Clotilda was not one of those dots because it was never recorded. So if we were to put extra dots in there for all of the boats that were smuggling folks in that were not recorded, the number would probably double. Next slide. You have to double click. Okay, go back one. Okay, so these are the thumbnail pictures of all of the boards that came in. All right, that's the amount of information that the jury, in fact, had to take a look at. We had a 16-member jury, biggest jury of all time. Half were architects, archaeologists, and historians. And we mated them with, guess what? Descendants, community activists, and public officials. So we had a wonderful conglomerate of folk to basically look at the design ideas that came in and judge the ones that were considered to be worthy. Next slide. And this is how I organized those 16 things. We call this the poster. So once the community said we want 16 things, I organized them into 4 geographic areas. And then for each geographic area, you had to basically select 4 things that you would put together. And when we lined them all up, they created the blue waves. This is the amount of research that went into the program. These were all the civic engagement meetings that we had with organizations. These are all the headlines. Architects Newspaper did stuff, AL.com, New York Architectural League, the Lagniappe, the Smithsonian. These are the design program covers. Each one of these had 40 pages in them, which equaled 160 pages of design programming. This is our design jury. There's Mario Gooden right there. Jack Travis was our global jury chair, half for architects, half from the community. Okay, design challenge, site 1, Memorial Shrine, 30 units of housing, Afrocentric boarding school, gateway to ancestors. And these are the ideas that came in. That's just a hint. I'm going real fast through all of this stuff, right? But look at the quality of design imagination. Each contestant basically turned in about 15 boards. Site 2, the Joe Allen housing site, a flood zone. So we insisted that you had to design a boathouse for the Clotilda, marine housing for seniors, Africatown Museum, and these are the winners that came in. You're just looking at the winning entries here. The caliber of work, the depth of thought. This is site 3, all water edge sites. You had to design the Africatown Yacht Club. We didn't come over in a yacht, so that was tongue in cheek. You had to design 15 pavilions that would tell the story on the water edge. You had to design a fleet of boats that could be managed by the community so they could generate revenue by doing their own eco tours about the history of that population and the importance of water. And then site 4 was Africatown Park, 160 acres for a Museum of Africa, a gateway, performing arts center. This was honorable mention. The African Museum in the park, the inverted pyramid, gateway back to Africa, walk on water through stained glass pavilions. This was Nicole Holland Dennis. And then these are the winning entries. Tuskegee's right here. Tuskegee joint ventured with Moody Nolan Architects. So just giving you a snippet of the caliber of design excellence that was extracted by asking a single question: what will the future of this place possibly look like? Here's some other things that happened. I got a grant to take the words and pictures of Zora Neale Hurston when she interviewed Cudjoe and turn it into construction drawings. We now have construction drawings where we can reconstruct the Cudjoe Lewis house. The American Roundtable of Nick is here. I brought the endowment, the Guggenheim, World Monuments Fund was a nomination, brought the National Organization of Minority Architects, AIA, the 9 videos, and here's another animation. And I think there's one more slide. You're gonna have to double click this one, or the replay. Yeah. These are all of the people that helped us to put this together. There's not a single hero for the design competition, but it really was a collaborative affair that took many months, many meetings, and we got many, many supporters. I do want to do a shout out to AIA, who gave us our initial seed money, to the National Organization of Minority Architects, to a Better Place Foundation, private foundation we had no idea that existed in the city of Birmingham. They wrote a check for 100,000 K for the cash prize money. We kissed the ground. We couldn't believe that it happened, but it did. So it takes a village to tell the story. It'll take a village to take it to the next step of what needs to be done. A couple of things that are going to happen next. We always decided that the owners of the competition would be the community itself. So there is going to be a book prepared that has all of the submissions in it, Kamal and Jerome and XYZ and all the firms, that we're going to give as a gift to the community so they can use it as a community design catalog, okay, that can inform all of the decisions that they might ever make. And because it's more than one solution, they can pick and choose pieces and parts of solutions that make sense for them at the time. So they will end up receiving, this will be volume 1 with the actual design program in it. Volume 2 will be the same size with all the winning submissions. And then there's one other outcome very positively that has happened. I got asked so many questions about how do you get from ideation to implementation that I said, let me see if I can't put that all together in the form of a book, which is now a nonprofit that I just started called SPADE, 52 Tools of the Trade, so the community can learn how to stack the deck in its own favor, right? Now, The design competition is just one of the tools that we use. You know, we got a lot of tools. But I came up with 52 things that you've got to know how to do in order to implement any idea. And I've divided it into 4 suits, okay? I call it spade because spade is used as a tool for digging and turning dirt, which you've got to do in order to build anything. So here, shovel versus spade. A shovel is for moving material with a flatter, shallower face, while a spade is primarily for cutting soil and digging holes. The spade is meant for digging, piercing, cutting. It is an edge tool, first and foremost. And I also want you to know that usually the spade in the deck is black. That doesn't hurt at all either. So I'm going to pass the book around because this is going to be the next stage of things that we must do in order to implement things.
I told you she was amazing, didn't I? I ain't seen that presentation, so like I said, every time I see it, she comes with it. The next person that I would like to bring up is Jerome Haferd. I had the opportunity to meet him in person this summer. Beautiful thing about Zoom is you meet all these wonderful people in a little box and you don't realize there's actually a 3-dimensional thing, person that's there. But I got a chance to meet him, very powerful individual. He's an activist, he's an architect, designer, and he is the winner of the Site 2 competition. So Mr. Jerome, come on up. He has a presentation for you all.
All right, Renee, can you all hear me? You're always a tough act to follow. Where's Renee? There you go. All right, but I will try. Hi, everybody. This has been an amazing day. It's really amazing and wonderful to see some folks that I know from the architecture and design community, some friends and colleagues, and I rewatched Descendant 2 nights ago. So I'm seeing familiar faces from that incredible story, and this is truly an honor. So my name is Jerome Haferd. I'm a licensed architect, I'm proud to be. As Rashida also said, there are not many African-American licensed architects. I have a practice called Jerome Haferd Studio, which is based in Harlem, New York. Where do I click here? Okay. But I'm originally from Akron, Ohio, which I'll talk about briefly in a moment. And at this point, working on sites of African-American significance, indigenous significance, and marginalized history has really become why I do this. I'm also a professor at City College in Harlem. And so really teaching and investigating how these sorts of sites really open up my discipline and open up a new imagination has become really why I do this work and why I practice. And so, I entered this competition because of that, because this is one of those sites. I also entered this competition to represent as an African-American Black excellence within this international competition. My father was born in rural Georgia, and my story is part of this larger American story. And I think that's why Africatown is so important. He's part of the Great Migration, and I am part of the Great Migration, which is really part of this legacy. And so, I really wanted to enter to sort of demonstrate that, to sort of think about the Black imagination as we think about Africatown, and to also show that we're out here. There are African American architects like myself with our own practice, working and able to do big things and doing big things. So this work has sort of taken me to different sites around the country, and I really it's already been one of the honors of my career to be part of this competition and to just share this design effort. I know there are other winners here, other people who participated. And so I'm going to just kind of reiterate a couple things. Renee spoke about the sort of 4 sites of the competition that we all sort of wrapped our heads around through this amazing brief that was written. You can see here my office placed and submitted it to site 2, which was heavy enough of a lift. But there were 3 other sites that kind of made this up, and I actually participated in a sort of collaborative dialogue with some of the other winning teams when we were thinking about the sort of holistic picture that was put forth by this amazing brief. And so these are some of the things that we were sort of thinking about in that larger dialogue with WXY and with Victor Bodie-Lawson. And again, these are some of the things that I was even asking about in that question earlier about what does it mean for the land to be the broker of our reparations? What does it mean to sort of think about the planning, the curatorial approach, the architectural program, and about some sort of maybe transcendent themes that might unite this large of a project and might show up in the materials that are used and the motifs that get repeated that might be interpreted differently, but that are sort of guidelines like Renee has sort of been talking about. And so we were thinking about things like mythology, materiality, economy, and a gateway to the past and the future. And so this is an aerial view looking at all 4 sites. I'm not sure if I can click here, but I was really drawn to site 2 as really this transition between, in a way, land and water. Black Americans, there's this legacy of being associated with the water. But what does it also mean to sort of think about land, right? And so this transition point is something that really drove the thinking of our submission. And I want to give a big shout out. This is an image of the video that I made with my team, Shadeen, Soraya, Violet, Tiffany, Gabriel, and Stephanie. And I think it's important to note that this team, mostly of young Black and brown African diaspora designers, architects, many of whom I've taught at City College, participated in this. And I think it's important to really give them a big shout out. Okay. So I'm just going to start to read a little bit of the description of the project, which is titled In the Wake. And then it will go from some research and then into the design work. And again, this was really a sort of imaginative response to this incredible brief. As we were working on this project, the depth of the brief really sort of was this vehicle to simply respond because there was so much imaginative Afrofuturist thinking that was already coming out of all of the material that we've been hearing about today. So I hope you all like it. I think you liked it enough to select our team. Okay. What does it mean to be in the wake? Writer Christina Sharp asks this as she ponders Blackness as existing in the paradoxical wake of loss, slavery, of ceremony for the dead, and emergence. Through the research, our team began to imagine Site 2 as the transition point between land and water, and in between that is neither land nor sea. Our proposal attempts to embrace and render material this condition of in-betweenness that we see again and again in the Black diasporic experience. And the initial ideas developed around how to conceptualize a new relationship to this transition and encounter between land and water. And so here are some of the images of the sort of submission to the brief, the project. So Site 2, which is at the former Josephine Allen House's site, in the wake, our submission embraces this multi-layered in-betweenness of water and land, urbanistically, materially, and architecturally. the concept seeks to tap into the woven co-indigeneity of stewardship, both native and African, the doubleness of Cudjoe Lewis and his descendants, the double consciousness of Black Americans, trees of two woods, and the doubling of ground and surface, the literal layers that define a new relationship to land and water. The project dreams a new imaginary for our relationship to the ground, the sky, and the social plane of Africatown, one that is layered, billowing, and porous. And again, this idea of both thinking about a new relationship and remediation of this landscape, as well as architectural form, was something that we thought about a lot. And so these are just some images of this public housing that has been since demolished that I just wanted to put up on the screen. Yes, and here's an aerial view of the site. And again, even thinking about how do we think about preservation when this is really a landscape, right? Okay, I'll go faster. So we proposed an urban design plan over top of this mostly raised public housing site that interweaves an intentional floodplain with the 4 venues of Site 2 that you see here highlighted, an Africatown museum and the adjacent Clotilda Boathouse Archive for a display of the replica of the Clotilda slave ship, as well as design concepts for 300 units of maritime housing, an idea of housing that could coexist with the aquatic landscape, and finally a ceremonial gateway of baptism, which creates a public plaza connected to land and water. And so here was our site plan, thinking about this kind of proposal, which again was centered around the placement of the Africatown Museum kind of at the heart of this new neighborhood, and the adjacent Clotilda Boathouse to create a new civic plaza and wrap the 2 venues in a sort of porous or woven facade that might allow for the public, landscape, even water to flow in and out of the buildings as seamlessly as possible. And then the plaza could be surrounded by new and restored streets at various scales of this housing, this maritime housing, which in a way could be miniature versions of these larger buildings, right? And so here was a perspective view that we began to think about these sort of venues. So you see then at the bottom a sort of side view thinking about the relationship between a sort of museum that is also simply a public space that then sort of flows into the boathouse archive and then flows literally into the floodplain, into the water. And so these sort of transcendent central ideas were very simple that sort of pervade these elements of the site. And it's centered around these 2 ideas, really thinking about, again, the land and sort of earth. So maybe a heavy rammed earth sort of architectural language. And then again, the lighter, the woven, the weave for a sort of the coil weave envelope. And the juxtaposition of these 2 material ideas, solid and woven, provide a means for the sort of contemporary and ancestral design. And so here I'm just going to sort of go quickly through some final images, thinking about the museum. And could, again, this museum be really thought of as a bigger version of a domestic space? The museum is a kind of Western idea, right? Museums originally were just your house. So could we think about this in a similar way, right? So looking to, again, the kind of woven and the heavy and African architecture, the Yoruba architecture, thinking about craftsmanship, thinking about materials, and who knows what you guys may end up doing and come up with. Hopefully this sparks ideas. And then, of course, the boathouse, which in a way, again, responding to the brief, this replica could become a kind of public archival statement, right? As with many of the elements of this. And I think living in an age and in a part of the country where this history is actively denied, what does it mean for architecture to participate in the sort of remembrance of this history? And so then the actual archival material might be encased in a kind of rammed earth plinth beneath the replica. And then finally, thinking about housing, our team, we were sort of really thinking about how to begin to merge with the landscape, a kind of remediation of the landscape. And again, the housing really as just a microcosm, a smaller version of these larger buildings with a sort of porous envelope and then a kind of rammed earth interior. And then finally, the gateway, working with the circle and the crescent as an ancestral shape to gather and embrace the floodplain. Here's that image. Again, thinking about ancestral African, Afro-Indigenous dwellings. And I'm just going to end on this slide because this is a built project. This is a public art piece called Sankofa here in Harlem, which we really took some of the thinking that had come up during this competition and began to do, community co-produced design work. And I think that nothing happens by accident, but I got the call that I was one of the winners of this competition when I was inside of this pavilion, sort of finishing it this past spring. So it literally comes full circle. And I just wanted to show how some of these ideas might kind of become reality. Thank you very much.
You stay up.
Okay. Oh, we doing questions now? Okay. Shall I go?
If we can have our presenters along with Mario Gooden come up.
Okay.
And while we're setting up, I would like to talk about full circle real quick. You had a chance to see that Tuskegee participated in the competition. And this is a real full circle moment for us because as I was talking to Dr. Joe outside about the Mobile County Training School, Booker T. Washington played a role in Africatown in the early days. You fast forward about 4 years ago, 6 years ago now, I came down to Mobile and I was there on a trip and I'd heard about this place called Africatown. I said, you know what, I want to come and see, where is this Africatown? And this speaks to the community that's there. And this is something coming from Jersey. I'm about to tell you a story that you wouldn't have in Jersey. I came up to somebody in a big old cargo van and I said, excuse me, where is Africatown? And she said, it's around, it's here, but I'll introduce you to somebody who can tell you a little bit more because I don't know a lot about it. So she walks me up the street to someone's house and they were in a house playing cards or just having some fun, whatever, and they bring me in. And she said, this gentleman just came and asked me about Africatown. Can you help him? They said, well, no, we can't help him, but I'm going to take you to somebody who can. They walked me around the corner to somebody else's house. Those are two things that would never happen in Jersey. I go to that house, we knock on the door, the gentleman opens up, and same story. This gentleman here, he wants to know about Africatown. And they said, wow, I was just telling my son, I wish that more people knew about Africatown, and here you are knocking on our door. They sat me down, and I think about 3 hours, told me about Africatown. I learned about Satchel Paige and all the baseball players who came out of Africatown. I learned about Plateau and how everybody has a different story about what's Africatown. And what was amazing about that was it showed me the truth of the community that's there, the community that, as I rode around and I saw the refineries and I saw the environmental justice, environmental racism issues that are there, that's not the community. The community is that love, that openness, that willingness to bring you into their home and tell you who they are. And as you got a chance to see, that community touched designers all around the world to assure that their community was properly represented. And so for this segment, and what's our time on this? Gotta make sure we got our time right. 30 minutes, okay, beautiful. So for this segment, we're going to talk about the design competition. And there's one more gentleman who has joined us, Mario Gooden, who is, he was, I guess, my colleague, which is, it feels so amazing to be able to say. as one of the jurors, well, one of the,
Design commando.
thank you, design commandos. So when we think about the way this design competition was structured, you had the chief, the general, Jack Travis, who oversaw all of the design competition process. And then you had design commandos, of which I was one, Mario was the other, was it Bill Gilchrist was the other one.
And then David Hughes.
And David Hughes. Again, three giants. I'm just happy to be in their shadow. And we served as the coordinators of the jurors. And because of, and this is the genius of the design of this jury process, the way it was set up, because you had community members who were a part of the jury, it was necessary to have somebody to translate what people would be looking at. Because as architects, we think everybody knows what we're doing. The reality is, it's like, oh, that's a nice, pretty picture. And so what I found was it was really important for us to really translate the ideas that were being presented to the community so that they could really understand what the designer was seeking to say as they were doing their work. And you see the work, you see the results. And I also have to say this was a very honest, a very blind jury, because I had no idea what Tuskegee had done. I knew my students had competed, but I didn't look at it because I respect that process. And I did not even know if I even, when I looked at their project, I had no idea it was their project that I was looking at. But I also was not a decision maker, so that was also good. So before we go, I would like to actually start with Mario. He is the Dean of the Graduate School of Architecture at
Director of the Master of Architecture.
Director. Yes, politics is important. Yes. Yeah. I understand. He is the director.
He's the dean?
He is the director of the graduate school. I will say that again to the world. He is the director of the Graduate School of Architecture at Columbia University, and he is also the principal of his own design firm. So I'll start with you, Mario. Can you speak to what the experience was like being invited to participate and then viewing the different designs?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kwesi. Well, first, I also want to thank Renee Kemp-Rotan, who Jerome was asking me how long we've known each other, and I said, well, we were on this program or some program in 2018, but actually I think I've known Renee. It's much longer than that, which I don't know, probably goes back to an AIA event or something like that. So it was, this was a really unique competition and jury. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it. And when Renee told me about it for sites, for venues, I said, they're designing 16 buildings or 16 proposals. But seeing the work was really, I have to say, heartwarming and gratifying, and one that there was so much international interest in Africatown. People wanted to know, and people wanted to be engaged. And it was really, there were teams from all around the world, teams from China, from Taiwan, from India, Turkey, South Africa. So this has really, captured, if you will, the global imaginary. And to see the response in terms of the designs. Jerome said during his presentation that, a museum is a sort of Western or European idea.
Right.
And so to see how the design teams that submitted, how they were perhaps also thinking that way. And so you couldn't just design a museum that you'd seen before, right, somewhere else for Africatown. And so for me, it was just really exciting to think about, 5 years after emancipation, purchasing 5 square miles of land, and now a design competition for Africatown where there wasn't anything before, where the former enslaved did not have anything. So how do you think about architecture in that context? So it was a real sort of challenge, I think, for the designers, but also a challenge, as a architect member of the jury to think, well, what would I do? How would I respond to this? So I have to say, I think and as you said, it was a blind jury, but I think that all of the sites were, and all of the selections were just spot on, because we could all sort of recognize that each of the designs were onto something, and they got it, that they got it.
Thank you. A question for you, Renee. Can you speak about the journey of uncovering the history in the research? Because if you've not been to the website, it was constantly being populated with content that you were uncovering. There's a whole curriculum, a lot of content. I mean,
A lot of content.
yes, I mean, it's mind blowing the curatorial engagement that you went through and research that you captured. Can you speak about what drove you to have that kind of process, and then what it was that you learned in that process that allowed you to inform the design process?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The driver for the program was really the community. After spending time with Joe and Anderson and Ramsey Sprague, who was going through a zoning challenge, at the time, and the community was fighting environmental issues. And so one of the things that I really knew was that even though this was about design ideas, the responses to the design challenge had to be authentic. There had to be an authenticity to it, so we wouldn't end up with some flash-in-the-pan Disneyland response. So all of the questions and all of the research really bubbled up from the community, who had done a hell of a job. They had a revitalization plan already. But of course, we know most revitalization plans are in 2 dimensions. And I kept saying, well, what's it gonna look like? What's it gonna look like? So the intellectual curiosity of me, discovering Africatown, because the boat was discovered. Had the boat not been discovered, then all of the attention that we now are looking at Africatown would have never happened. Africatown has been there for 160 some years, but the dominant culture denied that there was even a ship. That's why Miss Lorna Wood said, they said there wasn't no ship. And then the ship was found. Now the dominant community has a big problem. How do they explain the fact that the ship they said that didn't exist finally pops up, Kamal Siddiqui, after being submerged underwater all of these years? So the attitude that I took in putting the program together was an archaeological one. I had to start digging up the history so that I could take the history and remold it into terms that designers could respond to. And as I went through that process, plus, COVID got in the way, so thank God for Amazon, because they were delivering books to my house every day about Africa, African architecture. So I had a big pile of stuff. And then I said, well, it really wouldn't be fair to the competitors if I don't share with them everything I'm reading. So I started launching onto the website all of the books that I was using as reference, and all of the lectures and all of the podcasts. And the case study that we did for American Roundtable, all right? Mario was wearing another hat up here. He's also president of the New York Architectural League, which is a major think tank on urban and rural policy in terms of development. They had just launched American Roundtable, which was a competition to put together editorial teams to look at 5 gaps of development that prohibits communities from coming into their full fruition. So we had 5 topics that were pre-selected. We had to look at public space, public health, infrastructure, working economy, and environmental issues. And what started out as just a 20-page little report turned into a 220-page case study of the challenges presently facing Africatown. We put that on the website. The website was so full of information, and then on top of that, there was a design program what you got to do to win the money, right? So because I'm an urban designer, I'm very interested in the ensembles of buildings, not just a single building, but it's the ensembles of buildings that can begin to speak to place making, place knowing. And so those were the things, everything that I had to teach myself, I wanted to share with the people who were, competing.
Yes. Now, something I think is also important to acknowledge, the Clotilda was found after you started to do the ideas competition.
That's right.
So that timeline is important. I mean, folks in Africatown knew it was out there, but the the Alabama Historical Commission and the Park Service did not recognize that, and the research was not done to acknowledge that until after the design competition was well underway. So I'd say, with the work you were doing, the ancestors were clearly saying, "We're here," right? Can you also speak about the fact that this is an ideas competition? That term, ideas competition, rather than just a design competition, is important. Can you talk about why you selected that?
Yeah, it was political. When we first started the competition process, there was a member of Vicky's board that got us entree to actually sit with the mayor of Mobile, who couldn't have been less interested in a design competition because he came from the dominant culture that sold the lumber to build the boat in the first place. So he really wasn't interested in Africatown. And when the boat was found, I mean, my God, now he's got a lot of splaining to do, Lucy. You dig what I'm saying? So all of the zoning challenges, where we're trying to get this design idea competition launched, we literally had the mayor of Mobile who was trying to change the zoning regulations to turn residential property land uses in Africatown into industrial. So there's a fight going on there. But when I talked to the mayor, I showed him the whole slideshow. He says, well, what do you want me to do about it? I said, well, it'd be nice to put the city seal on the competition cover, and maybe you can put $10,000 into the kitties so we can. He says, I'm not doing any of that. I said, but I thought you said you liked the show. He said, yeah, I like the show, little lady, but I'm not giving you any money until you prove to me that you can build the stuff you're talking about. And I said, this is about design ideas. I said, but guess what? Ball is in your court, Mr. Mayor, because all 16 of those sites are publicly owned, all right? So I had already given the community a hidden tool whereby which they could come back and negotiate.
Awesome.
What could happen.
Awesome. So next question to you, Jerome. How did your design approach have to change given the program that you received and the power of the place that you were designing for?
You mean from a typical project?
Correct.
Well, I think this site, if it's not already abundantly clear, is one of, even amongst sites like this, I think of a certain order of site that has national and international significance. And I have been looking at, I live in Harlem, right? So in a way, this is part of a journey of trying to ask these questions of how does our discipline or the built environment professions begin to speak a different language a little bit, because we don't have a lot of this content in our history. And when you go to architecture school, until very recently, you learn about the Parthenon, you learn about Rome, and that's pretty much what you learn about. So this isn't, I didn't enter this in a vacuum, to be honest, but it definitely the ambition of the competition amped up the challenge to sort of think on multiple registers, right? And to think again about preservation when in the case of Site 2, it's really more of a landscape that has been polluted, has been desecrated in a way. right? I've been looking at sites like the Harlem African Burial Ground, which is also a site that has no sort of heroic existing architecture and has a desecrated landscape. And so how do we think preservation in that context? And for me as a designer, it means thinking also always about the future and what would we build if we had the resources in the first place, right? I think preservation, that's at stake when we're talking about preservation. So there was a lot of imagination built into the project, built into the brief already. We had a lot of time because the deadline got extended. So I was looking at this over the summer with a few of these young folks in the office, just casually. We were just doing more informal sort of things, kind of meeting on Saturday or on Thursday after, when there wasn't a lot going on in the summer. And then it kind of got closer to the submission time, and it was really like, I think something about this idea again of something solid, like rammed earth, the land, and then something more ephemeral, like weaving, and how we can begin to sort of weave these materials together to create a vocabulary that might speak to this.
Can you talk also about how it was transformative for you as a person? Because for those that are in the audience who, whether you went to architecture school or not, we know that the majority of our training in this country is a very Eurocentric approach. So even though we've made contributions, in many cases we're the foundation upon which this country is built, that contribution is not included, right?
Right.
And so if you're going through architecture school and you're not learning about that, then it means there's a learning that you have to have in order to approach this. So how has this design competition or design ideas competition transformed you as a person and as a designer?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I want to ask you also this question, and all of you. I feel like it's hard. It's hard being an architect. It's hard being an architect of color, running a small practice, teaching. These things are not easy, and yet I feel like I'm part of a generation of folks who are, and part of, frankly, a renaissance around places like this, around design culture, and what our role might be. And there's not enough of us to do the work. I'm overwhelmed with things to be involved with that I feel like I really should be involved with or want to be involved with, that need voices like the people up on this stage and in this crowd. So it's been the last 6-7 years have been pretty transformative. But it's part of the journey that we're on. And again, I partially did this just because, just to be in dialogue with some of you all around these issues.
Yeah, I would say that, not as the designer participant with this competition, but just in general as a designer or an architect of African descent, that it requires interdisciplinary thinking.
Right.
We cannot think about design or architecture in the way in which the dominant culture, I'm going to start using that phrase.
That's a good one.
The way in which the dominant culture does. I mean, architecture as a modern discipline, as a modern profession, emerges in Europe at the same time as European colonization. Architecture is complicit with colonizing the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. So we have to rethink, when we come to projects like this, that might say museum or boathouse or what have you. We have to rethink, well, what does that mean, to us? Mm-hmm. And how do we think about this in a much more expansive and discursive way, that it's not simply about making it a beautiful object or about the aesthetics, but there's a phrase that's become, I think, much more sort of much more useful in the design disciplines, and that is the built environment. So we're not just simply thinking about the object, but we're thinking about the land, we're thinking about landscape, we're thinking about ecology, we're thinking about the environment, because we cannot think about, climate change, for example, without thinking about environmental justice. And we can't think about sort of property without sort of thinking about, well, who occupied this land? And one of the things that as a member of the jury for Site 2 that caught my eye right away was in reading the essays, and I think that was a kind of brilliant strategy in terms of organizing the competition to ask the teams to provide design essays, is the interdisciplinary thinking that went on. So Jerome's reference in his project to Christina Sharp. And when I read that, I was like, oh, someone is quoting Christina Sharp in the wake. Who is that? I was like, that's, okay, I got to get deeper into this, because that takes you out of, we don't talk about Christina Sharp in most architecture programs or in the wake. So, that requires, now we're into sort of Black studies, we're into poetry, we're into literature. I mean, that is all becoming part of the practice and how we have to think. And I think that, someone who I admire so much, the artist and filmmaker Arthur Jaffa says that Black people in America created culture out of free fall, and I think that's brilliant. Yeah, and we had to actually remake sort of culture, right? And I think that's what we have to do with architecture, and I think that's what this competition really allowed. And hopefully everyone can recognize it in the images that Jerome saw. That's nothing like we've ever seen before. That's not a museum or boathouse that we've seen before. And I think it's brilliant.
I wanted to chip in here too. There was something else that was going on at the time that the competition was basically being invented. Mario was authoring a book called Dark Space. Mario and Mabel Wilson are co-directing the Global Africa Lab at Columbia University. We've got Dr. Carla Jackson Bell, who is dean at Tuskegee, having written a book called Space Unveiled, The Role of Culture in the Design Studio. We've got the stuff going on up at Harvard, GSD.
Yeah, Black in Design.
Yeah, Black in Design.
Dr.
We've got Jerome Haferd and his team of renegade thinkers who managed to get Architects Magazine, the October issue this month, to dedicate the entire magazine of American architecture around the discourses that professors and activists in Black space are having cross-country. We've never had an American architecture magazine dedicated strictly to issues of dark matter in Black space. So something's going on out there, and thank goodness that architects of color, planners of color, urban designers of color, we're all co-joined. We know that we were given a mission and a task when Whitney Young, president of the National Urban League in 1968, as our cities were burning, LA, Watts, DC, Detroit, burning to the ground in response to the King assassination, the AIA, which was 99.9% white male, made the mistake of inviting Whitney Young to be the keynote speaker at the AIA convention.
Famous.
And Whitney Young says, do you understand how totally irrelevant you are as a profession to have created cities that burn themselves down? Something's wrong with that picture. So he made a challenge to the American Institute of Architects to diversify the profession of architecture. 2 years later, AIA conjoined with the Ford Foundation to do a national search for 20 Black kids to go to the architecture school of their choice so that diversity in the profession could begin. I was one of the 20. So I knew when I went to architecture school, I was already on a mission, because the people who had put up the money had told me that unless I do something, I'm going to be irrelevant too. And then NOMA was formed. The National Organization of Minority Architects, put together by 12 Black men who were pissed off at not getting any contracts out there. So that was really our first union of Black architects in America, and they brought with them the student union. So before we know it, NOMA is a movement, and there are only 4,000 NOMA members. Yeah, I mean, in toto, we all know each other. We all talk to each other, we share each other's works. I've known Kwesi since he was a student, at Tuskegee. And so there is this continuum that we know we must do something with all of the skill sets. When you're trained in architecture, I'm telling you, you hit every single discipline that's out there. You've got to understand human behavior. You got to know how people sit in chairs. You got to know how to light the room so they can read the book that Mario wrote. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in the training. And so it's probably one of the most multidisciplinary inspections that one can have as a discipline. And I've always used design as my personal method of inquiry. Someone was asking Dr. Plant, well, what was your lens? She was like, framework. Framework. It's a pretty big frame. And the design competition insisted that you put together a multidisciplinary team. We said, go get your favorite archaeologist, your historian, your artist. You all buckle up and buckle down and try to make something beautiful of this quest. So there's also the other dimension which deals with the spirit of a place. Africatown is not just, brick and mortar. My first emotional experience with Africatown was when Vicki took me to that cemetery. Mm-hmm. I couldn't believe that there were names printed on the tombstones in Yoruba language and also plantation names. I mean, most Black folks in this room have no idea what their African names were. You can spit on cotton, send it to Ancestry.com, and they can give you a kind of good idea of where you might come from. But they aren't going to tell you the name of your great-great-great-grandfather.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's what makes Africatown special. Let me say this about Africatown, and write this down. It is the only 19th century settlement built in America by Africans. Yeah. Let me say it again. It's the only 19th century settlement built in America by Africans. All the other exodusters, all the other Black chartered towns were built by African Americans. So they're the only sample that we have. It's got to be protected for that kind of reason, as well. And that's why whenever I talk about Africatown, the first thing that I say is God bless the people from Africatown who have held on to this story, didn't have F to do with the boat, because they were told the boat didn't even exist. They held into the story because I never forget Miss Lorna Woods came to a civic engagement event that I did at the Mobile Public Library, and I had the archivist from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute as speaker because I wanted him to share with the community how their artifacts could be appraised, cataloged, inventoried, and insured. And Miss Lorna sat at the back of the room. She said, come here, baby. She had a duffel bag with her. She took out whips and chains and stuff that had been passed down. I almost fell on my face. And she said, and if you think this is something in this duffel bag, you need to see what else the people are hiding up in Lewis Quarter. I'll never forget that. These folks are protecting their history with every piece of breath and life that they have. So my only question was, how could I, through my field and discipline of architecture, begin to imagine what, in fact, their future might begin to look like? And it's a very emotional story. It's a very spiritual place. And we thank you for the guardianship and inviting us in to even take a look at what it is you're protecting. Because you can't just walk on up into Africatown, okay? They sniff you out before they invite you onto the porch, And a couple of people have been booted out of town too. So this has been a real privilege, just looking at the possibilities of what architecture could bring to protect, the spirit of a place that we consider very sacred. And I will say this, we got design responses from all over the world. The 20,000 hits that we got on the website, we have them all categorized by country. I mean, the response was unfreaking believable. So we know that there is a desire out there for people who answer the quest of built environment question to do something that's going to be culturally competent. It's no longer enough to be trained in how to basically rub two sticks together to build a house, all right? And that's really what Whitney Young was saying. If you want this stuff to stand up, then the neighborhood that you're building better have some relationship to the people in such a way that they will protect it with every breath of life that they can basically respond to. So it was a spiritual experience all the way around.
So I have one last question, and then I have a question for the audience, starting with the descendants and then everyone else. So the last question is, what's next? If we think about the feedback that came from the last panel, questions like, how do we keep the people in the town? How do we assure that the people buy in, the youth specifically, that they engage with this kind of work? They understand architecture and design, and they become agents of their own space. So I want to pose that question to all three of you. What's next after a design ideas competition to address the present need in Africatown, since we know that that's all over the world?
Can I say a few words about that? Only because I've given it some thought.
Thinking of
I've been thinking about that because really the notion design idea was kind of tongue in cheek. It was so nobody would get upset about you trying to move the furniture around politically. Okay, because land ownership is a very political, you start talking to dominant culture about you moving stuff around and changing zoning. So design idea keeps it elevated. But at the same time that was going on, I had successfully nominated Africatown to the World Monuments Watch, which enabled us to convene the leadership of the CDCs that were in Africatown. And I said, what's on your wish list? Once we got the wish list together, we started trying to put those wish lists into funding proposals. So we already have an economic development framework plan that needs to be funded that would answer the questions about market analysis, that would answer the question about the relationship between demographics and the tourism industry. But that study has got to be funded. We also put together a framework for the conservation of the cemetery. And I'm talking about it's down to the nits and the grits, all right? Because we were basically dealing with the brother that just finished doing the Monticello burial ground. We brought in Dr. Michael Blakey, forensic archaeologist for the African burial ground in New York, down to Africatown. So we would have some archaeological foundation upon which to build. Now, one last thing I'll say, next steps, we have got to get the studies funded. The framework for these studies have already been written. And we have the talent out there actually who can do the work. We still have data to collect. One last thing. Africatown is a historic site approved by the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 2012. Because of politics, there were about 7 neighborhoods that were left out of what is now called Africatown. Those boundaries need to be extended. Jocelyn knows for a fact, and I heard from Miss Lorna, how come Lewis Quarters ain't in the historic district? Amen. That's something that has got to happen. So the dominant culture made sure that the little circle, the lasso around historic Africatown was very, very tiny. Okay, and they blocked out 7 other neighborhoods that are also a part of the story. And so the competition made sure with that Africatown Cultural Mile, when we decided we were going to do more than one site and the dots are all connected, you got a regional story to tell. And that becomes a very immersive user experience, for the tourist, which generates even more dollars. One last word.
I got it.
National Trust, the National Trust application that went in and got approved in 2012, the first sentence said, all of Africatown is one large archaeological site. Okay? So the history isn't just buried in that cemetery. Every step you take, you're walking on a part of the story that Deborah Plant talked about, that Hurston wrote about, in Barracoon, and thank God she wrote it down.
Yes.
So I'd just like to say, I mean, I think everything that Renee is saying is really spot on and terrific, but I think that's for the adults in the room. I truly believe in the power of architecture and design to empower young people.
Right.
I decided I wanted to be an architect, I think, around age 11 or something. And that's because my mother would drive me to our little county library in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and I would sit in the row of architecture books, and I would just go through each one of them. And I would say, I have never seen a space like that before. I've never been in anything. This is what I want to do. I want to design something for me. So I have a suggestion, and that would be to take these designs, take these ideas to the young people of Africatown, to the school kids, to the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 high school students. Get them involved in preserving and imagining the future of
Yes.
for Africatown.
Yes.
You know, get them in the process. It may not be immediate, but we're talking about the long term here. We're playing the long game, because we don't want to just, you know, rebuild and preserve Africatown for now. You know, they're going to be the adults in the future. So let's bring them on board now. That's the thing that I would advocate to the community, because it's, you know, I'm still here, you know, loving architecture from when I was a 11-year-old, and I can't imagine doing anything else.
Awesome.
And if you know, just a handful of kids, you know, could be empowered that way, I think then they wouldn't want to leave. They would want to stay.
Definitely. Definitely.
And if those kids like it, you can hire me
Hey.
and Kwesi and,
Hey.
and him. But, you know, to second everything that was said, I also think that we're beginning, I think architecture is a very competitive profession, but, you know, I love this idea of the sort of the kids and the young people even helping to build whatever ends up being built. Because at the end of the day, we can think about, and that's why I showed that project at the end, architecture is a very generous framework. What we do is figure out how to plug as many people in to doing things, whether it be a piece of public art or a building or an infrastructure. So I think from the community standpoint, from the land standpoint, there's room for everybody if we just approach it from an abundance framework and not a scarcity framework.
Yes. Awesome. Now, for the audience, I want to open it up. 5 minutes? Okay. I would like to ask one question of the descendants. Do you all agree with the quality of the work that was presented to represent your homes? Hey, did a job well done. All right, so we'll open it up to the audience. Yes. Hold on a second.
I mean, it's just a thought that it came to me because I've been hearing it for the whole day. Do you think, because a lot of architects are sitting on the podium, do you think architecture in America in the future will become so inclusive that the color would be irrelevant? Especially the color.
No, because it should not be.
And especially in the light of the discourse that is happening on sustainability, because it becomes so inclusive that architecture, the color in architecture somehow becomes irrelevant and sustainability subsumes it. I mean, what's your thought on that?
Are you talking about color in terms of race or?
Yes.
No. I mean, I think no offense, I think that's a very white concept, right? If you don't recognize that all the color that exists in this space, that means you don't recognize the inherent individuality of every person that's sitting here. If I say that they're all going to be colorless, then I'm saying we're going to make them devoid of color, which puts us back to the space that we're already in. It's the color. It's the color of a rainbow that makes things great. You know, it's the color of a soup that has all of these, colors inside it, the different vegetables, the diversity of that space that makes it beautiful. And so if architecture goes that direction, then we got a problem.
Yeah, and I mean, I would also add to that, I think what we've heard today and more is that environmental racism, right, climate change is inseparable from the transatlantic slave trade, from white supremacy. We could have a technologically sustainable future and still have oppressed people everywhere. So I think we have to think about these things holistically.
Yeah. Yeah, I think within the studying architecture, there is this myth of the universal or the ideal subject. It was never an ideal subject. It was never universal, right? It was the colonizer and the colonized. So to not recognize that, and for the colonizer, if you will, not to recognize that they too are raced. To go back to
our lunchtime conversation.
Yes, Toni Morrison, who was evoked earlier today when,
Yes.
in that brilliant interview with Charlie Rose, where she just says to him, Charlie, don't you realize that you too are raced? That you're asking the wrong question. And so if, the dominant culture does not realize that they also are raced, then no, we cannot simply just say, oh, we have to eliminate, or can we not eliminate color or race from thinking about space and architecture, because space is highly race.
And color is everywhere. We're sitting in a room that is filled with color. If the room were not filled with color, then we would be rather watery. Do you know what I mean? Water has no color, no taste, it would be a pretty tasteless situation. All right? So we want all the flavors to be in. We just want to make sure that all the flavors get equal time. You know what I mean? Enough of red dye number 7, right? We need to make sure that everybody gets to sip on Kool-Aid according to, the contributions that their culture have made to the space that they occupy. It's more that kind of thing. Yeah.
Another question?
I just want to say first, I appreciate the symposium as just a community person in Philadelphia. I appreciate the process that laid to this architectural work, because I heard the community being involved in the beginning and in the end of the process. That's usually when these professions, communities are left out. So I think that I appreciate and respect that was done, because it's important to the other thing. And the last thing I'll say, to the point of how African people, global experience comes back around to African people architectural, three-dimensional reflection in the now. I think that's important to this discussion here, that you put out something that was centered in African people's story, and the response came back globally based off of African people's story in three-dimensional form. I think that's important in relationship to African people's contribution to whatever the future will be, as in that spiritual all that. And my last point in relationship to Brother Mario, what you said about the students and imagination, I think that's important, but I think it has to also include, if I'm not being arrogant and uninformed, to also providing the other professions that students can go into based off of that architectural imagination that's stimulated at such an early age, so that they'll be willing to see that they can make a living in the community that they come from. Without that, we'll still have this, whatever they call it now, brain drain or whatever this thing is that they'll go in. So I think when we're asking the community, or I'm asking to consider what you made, starting at preschool.
Oh, yeah.
Those pictures, those architectural designs, those images can spark the imagination of the future, this Afrofuturism, which that's another thing.
Can you call on Kamal? He actually participated in, I just want to hear just one word from him.
One more?
Kamal. Yeah, I just want to recognize Kamal for 2 seconds. His team actually won 3rd place for Site 1, and I just want to make sure that he says a few words on behalf of Team Jamaica,
Thank you
who
very
entered
much.
the competition.
I believe we need to add culture to color, because the problem is, coming from Jamaica, we have retained significant amount of our African culture.
Right.
As you go elsewhere in the diaspora, it is lost. So when someone sees color as being cultureless, then you ask the question, what next? But there is culture, and what makes Africatown very important to America is the retention of culture. And that's why it is important that we use Africatown as that flagship. Now, to stimulate the interest from the youth in Africatown to stay, we need to develop that master plan, right? And so that they can see something in the future that they can actually pick up. Now, if it's left in a vacuum, then you will have that continuity of people leaving. One of the things that we use in our proposal is the benefit of our African culture in terms of the Anansi symbol in Ghana, the Adinkra symbol, Anansi. The Anansi story is very alive and well in the Caribbean and in Jamaica and in some parts of the South. And the Anansi stories are really wisdom that is imparted. So we use a lot of that culture, the retentionism, in our solution. One of the proposals, the gateway to the ancestors, the reason why we use that tower, which is an element from the Ober's palace, is for it to be visible to youngsters so that they can identify it as a brand, so that they can see it when they travel out, they can come back to their culture. If there's nothing there, there's nothing for them to come back to. Thank you.
Thank you. To our panel, Mario, Renee, Jerome, thank you for all the energy and time that you've devoted. To the Africatown descendants who have given a thumbs up on the work, great. And to the audience, thank you for all being here. And I'll turn it back over to Amber.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you for your time, for agreeing to be a part of this day. I'd like to shout out the 40 some odd people who are still streaming with us online on YouTube, and then the thousands of people, hopefully, who will be seeing this online. It's being recorded. It will live on the Weitzman School of Design YouTube channel. So it's a wonderful archival material, or, we're going to have an archive in this case. I wanted to shout out a few individuals who are here with us in the room right now. Kamal Siddiqui, would you stand up, please? A diver. He is a board member and lead instructor with Diving with a Purpose, which is an international organization dedicated to the conservation and protection of submerged heritage resources. He was an integral part in helping with, I don't even know what you would call the dive, the expedition, the discovery of the Clotilda. So it's wonderful to have you. There are plenty of people who could easily have been on this stage too, and he's one of those. Obviously, Gary Lumbers, who has been, called out numerous times. We also have Kern Jackson. I know he's watching us. He was initially supposed to be here with us, but could not. And so, hello, Kern, out there in the universe, a folklorist who's done a lot of work with Nick, and I know Nick shouted him out earlier today. I'd also like to shout out Brent Leggs, who is here in the room, who's the executive director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. That title's almost as long as my title, okay? That took a lot to say. He's a board member of the board advisor to the Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites, so it's great to have him here with us. I'm trying to think. We have a reception. We have wine and cheese in the museum cafe for the folks who are here. We also have guides, like I said, who are going to be in the Africa Gallery. The Africa Galleries are actually adjacent to the museum cafe. There were two things that were brought up in this conversation. This last one that is a great way to end this particular symposium. One, when I had y'all stand up and talk about were you descendant from the Clotilda, if you know you had someone who came over through the Middle Passage, you are what remains. I almost wanted to say, and now I feel like I'm in the right to say it, if you have been impacted by the transatlantic slave trade, will you please stand? And that is part of the conversation around color too, because it's not just about Blackness and what Black folks have gone through. We have gone through this together. So we are all implicated in this story. And that's something that we should hold near to us as we think about the future. Another point to make, and I'll let you go because y'all think like we get to go, we have our wine and cheese now. Sankofa. There's actually a Sankofa paperweight, a gold weight here in this museum. And it's small. And I almost want to challenge you to find it when we go over there to the Africa Gallery, because I saw it, my jaw dropped, and I was like, that's it. That's the thing. That's the thing. So I hope you all take what you have. I know we're tired. Get you some wine if you drink. Get you some water if you don't. One more thing.
First of all, her work.
Oh. I'm just here to move chairs and supply water bottles. Like, that's what I do, hold babies and stuff, you know. All right, everyone, take care, enjoy yourselves, continue the conversations. Yes, thank you so much.